When he left me for my sister, I thought my heart would never recover. They posted pictures, smiling like I never existed. But a month later, I found an old map in his garage. It led to the lake, our place. There, beneath the surface, I saw the shape of something human. The police didn't believe me. So I went back at night, pulled a box out of the water. Inside were a pair of children's shoes, a wedding ring, and a woman's passport with his last name. He didn't just leave me behind. He started over, and he buried his old family in the lake. Now my sister is next.
They were the kind of couple people envied, the ones whose photos always looked too perfect to be real, the kind that smiled in dim light with eyes full of fire and fingertips touching like fate. They met in a library during a thunderstorm, which sounded ridiculous but wasn't. He offered her his umbrella and she laughed like she hadn't in years. His name was Julian. Hers, Claire. He said she smelled like old books and oranges. She told him he talked like a man who'd been alone too long. Everything fell into place so easily it felt like a trap, but it wasn't. Not then. The first year was made of snapshots, long walks by the lake, shared playlists, late-night pancakes, cheap wine, quiet confessions. He was a listener, patient and warm. She was scarred and tired, but something in his steadiness pulled her back from the static. He taught her how to breathe again. She taught him how to feel. Or so she thought. Julian wasn't flashy. He wasn't loud. But he was magnetic in a way she couldn't explain. Everyone seemed drawn to him, especially women. Claire noticed it, early but never said anything. She didn't want to be that girl. The insecure one, the jealous one, the one who questioned what hadn't yet gone wrong. Besides, he made her feel like she was the only one in the room. For a while. He said she was the first person who ever made him want to stop running. She believed him. Believed in the way he kissed her forehead when she couldn't sleep. In the way he wrote little notes and left them in her books. In the way he held her like she might disappear. She introduced him to her family after 8 months. It was Thanksgiving. Her sister Lily was visiting from New York. Blonde, bold, and always one step ahead in everything. Claire adored her and resented her in equal measure. She had always been the quiet one, the bookish one, the reliable disappointment in comparison. Lily lived fast and loud. Claire lived carefully, always afraid of being too much or too little. But she was proud to introduce Julian to Lily, and proud when Lily seemed surprised by how gentle and thoughtful he was. They all laughed that weekend. Too much wine, board games by candlelight, old home videos. It was one of those rare, warm snapshots of family that never quite lasts but somehow lodges itself in the heart. Claire didn't notice how long Lily's glances lingered when Julian spoke. She didn't catch the tiny smile they exchanged when they passed in the hallway. She was too busy feeling, for the first time in years, like her life had finally started, to settle into something worth keeping. They moved in together 2 months later. A small place near the lake with creaky floors and bad insulation, but charm in every corner. She filled the walls with art prints and old records. He built her a reading nook by the window. On Sundays they made waffles and watched horror films, their knees always touching. He had a drawer full of things she didn't recognize. Keys, notebooks, old receipts from places she didn't remember visiting, she asked once. He said he was just sentimental. She believed him. Love does that. It wraps your vision in gauze, softens the edges, turns red flags into roses. When things began to shift, it was slow. He was home later. His phone was always face down. He smiled less, touched her less. The laughter in the house thinned like old wallpaper. She thought it was stress. She offered space. She didn't press. She trusted. Until the night he came home with perfume on his jacket that wasn't hers, and said he'd been working late and didn't kiss her, and looked straight through her like she was a ghost. 3 weeks later, he was gone. No fight. No goodbye. Just a note on the fridge. I'm sorry. Please don't hate me. And Claire's world cracked like glass under heat. Her sister called, 2 days later, said she had something to confess. Claire didn't let her finish. She already knew. She'd known the second the silence became familiar. The second the ache settled in like an old friend. But it wasn't the betrayal that broke her. It was the realization that even when she had everything, she never really had him. That the perfect photos were just that. Moments, not proof. And now the only thing that still felt real was the lake. The one place they'd always returned to. The place they said they'd grow old beside. She went back there, alone. To forget. To grieve. To scream into the water. That's when she found it. And that's where the real story began. Claire didn't remember much about the days that followed. They blurred into one another, shapeless and cold, like waking from anesthesia only to realize the pain hadn't gone away. It had only become quiet, heavier, more permanent. She existed in fragments. A cup of coffee she didn't taste. The buzz of her phone she didn't answer. Rain on the window that felt like it was happening to someone else. Her body moved because it had to. Because rent had to be paid. Because the dog needed to be fed. Because the world didn't pause when hearts shattered. But inside, she wasn't there. Not really. The betrayal cut her open, but it wasn't just the betrayal that destroyed her. It was the narrative collapse. The dismantling of everything she thought she understood about herself, about them, about what love was supposed to mean. She hadn't just lost him. She had lost the future she'd begun to believe in. Every quiet plan, every unspoken assumption, all turned to ash the moment she realized he had never been fully hers. Not his time, not his body, not even his truth. There were hours when she sat on the floor of the bedroom they once shared, surrounded by the things they bought together. Blankets, candles, books they never finished. Just to punish herself. Just to sit in the echo of what they were. She ran her fingers over his handwriting on sticky notes he'd left on the fridge just weeks ago. Little reminders like, buy milk, or you're beautiful, written in the same ink. It felt obscene, now. A parody of love. She tore them down, not out of anger but desperation, as if erasing his words could erase the ache lodged between her ribs. People told her to be strong, to let go, to move on. But they didn't know what it was like to have your sister become a stranger overnight, to answer a phone call and feel your identity fracture with every word. Lily had tried to justify it, said it just happened, said she didn't plan it, said Julian wasn't who they thought he was. But Claire had already stopped listening by then. It wasn't about him anymore. It was about her. The hollow left behind. Grief crept in like rot, silent, steady, unavoidable. It didn't rage. It whispered. In the moments before sleep. In the spaces between tasks. In the way silence stretched longer in a room once full of music. She stopped wearing mascara because she kept crying in grocery store aisles. She stopped going out because every couple on the street looked like a cruel reflection. Even music changed. Songs that once made her feel alive now felt like glass under skin. Her apartment became a mausoleum. Curtains always drawn, lights dim, air thick. She avoided the lake. That was sacred ground, and she wasn't ready to desecrate it with her grief. It had been their place, the one that made them feel eternal. She couldn't bring herself to see it as just water and stones again. Not yet. She started writing again, not with purpose, just to exhale. Page after page of confessions, rage, aching questions. Why didn't I see it? What did I miss? How do you walk away so clean when someone else has to bleed for your freedom? Her journal became her witness, her paper therapist. Some pages were soaked, others torn, but it was the only place she told the full truth, because the world didn't want a woman broken. It wanted a woman recovering, and Claire wasn't ready to perform resilience. She thought about calling him. 1,000 times. Not to beg, Not even to scream. Just to hear his voice one more time and see if it sounded different now that she knew it lied. But she didn't. Because a part of her still believed that if she broke the silence, she'd lose the only power she had left, and so she stayed silent. And in that silence, something else began to grow. Not strength, not hope. Something darker. Something sharper. One night, unable to sleep, Claire wandered into their old storage closet. She wasn't sure what she was, looking for maybe nothing, maybe everything. She found a box he had labeled junk. Inside were books, chargers, a broken camera, and at the bottom a folder. Inside the folder, photos. Ones she hadn't taken, ones she'd never seen. A woman smiling on a dock, another in front of a cabin, a third, asleep. Eyes closed, serene. Too serene. Each photo had a date scribbled on the back. None recent, all carefully kept. She stared at them for a long time, her chest tight, her throat raw. They didn't make sense, not yet. But something about them felt wrong, too curated, too quiet. She should have thrown them out. She should have burned the box, but instead she kept it, shoved it to the back of her closet and told herself she was imagining things, but the seed had been planted, and rot spreads fast in silence. It began with a dream. Claire standing at the edge of the lake, barefoot, the water still and unnaturally dark, the trees behind her unmoving as if the world had frozen. Something beneath the surface called to her, not with sound, but with a feeling like pressure in the chest before a storm. She stepped forward. The water swallowed her feet, then her knees, then her waist, until she was gone. She never reached the bottom. She just kept sinking. When she woke, her sheets were soaked with sweat, her mouth dry, her hands clenched so tightly that her nails had broken skin. The lake had returned. It took her 3 more nights before she drove out to it, not out of courage, out of inevitability. It was no longer something she could ignore. It was pulling her like a tide, slow but unrelenting. The path down was overgrown, the trail thin, as though nature itself was trying to forget what had been. She parked and walked the final 100 feet, branches scraping against her coat, wind whispering through leaves in a language only the grieving understand. And there it was, the lake, still, waiting. She stood at the edge, trying to feel something familiar. The calm, the comfort, the illusion of eternity they had once shared. But it was gone. The surface looked the same, but the air was colder here, heavier. She stared across the water, her thoughts turning to the box, the photos, the dates. Why had he kept them? Who were those women? Why did their smiles feel like warnings? She came back the next day, and the day after. Each time she sat in the same spot on a stone bench that had begun to crack with age. She watched the lake, listened, thought. It became ritual. She brought coffee, then a notebook. Sometimes she wrote, mostly she sat. Until one morning, after a storm had passed through the night, she noticed something different. Near the far bank, just beyond the reeds, something white caught the light. Small, irregular. She thought it was trash at first, a piece of plastic maybe. But it didn't move with the breeze. It didn't float away. It stayed. Curiosity became obsession. She found herself scanning the water every morning, trying to locate it again. Sometimes she saw it, sometimes she didn't. And when it vanished for a full week, she decided to go into the water. She didn't tell anyone. Who would she tell? No one had been listening for a long time. She waited for a warm afternoon. She brought no towel, no plan. Just her boots, a jacket, and a stone in her chest. The water was colder than expected. It soaked through her jeans immediately, clawed at her skin, but she didn't stop. Step by step she walked in, heart racing, breath sharp. When it reached her ribs, she paused. The surface shimmered around her, deceptive in its calm. Then she dropped beneath it. The cold was stunning, immediate. It took her breath like a punch, to the lungs. Her arms moved blindly, her vision clouded by silt and shadow. But she saw it. White. Smooth. Outlined by algae and tangled roots. She swam closer. It wasn't plastic. It was bone. She surfaced with a gasp that tore through her throat, the sky spinning above her as she stumbled back to shore. Her knees gave out. She vomited into the dirt, coughing, shaking, drenched and alone with a truth too heavy to comprehend. She sat there for what felt like hours, the wet earth clinging to her palms, her clothes clinging to her skin. Something had been buried there, something real, something human. The next day she came back with gloves. She didn't call the police. She couldn't. Not yet. Not without knowing. Not without proof. She waded into the water again, this time slower, more deliberate. She followed the same path, using the trees on the opposite bank as a reference. She reached the spot, dug with her hands, her fingers scraping against stone, mud, tangled weeds. It was deeper than she remembered. But then, there it was again. More bones. A wrist. A rib. The remains of a shoe. And something else. Fabric. A strip of red cloth caught on a root, swaying like a flag. Her sister's favorite color had been red. The breath left her again, but not from the cold. From clarity. She pulled herself out of the water, collapsed on the shore, soaked and trembling. In her mind, images flashed like lightning. Julian's face when he lied, the way he laughed when he said Lily was just a phase, the folder in the box. Dates, names, women who never came back. One of them had written something on the back of a photograph. She remembered now. He took me to the lake. Claire didn't sleep that night. She sat by her window, watching headlights pass, her fingers tapping out questions into the silence. She wasn't crazy. She wasn't imagining things. There was something at the bottom of that lake, and it wasn't just evidence. It was a story. A graveyard. A secret someone had buried and expected never to be disturbed. And now that someone was living in her sister's house. The world above the surface was still pretending nothing had changed. But Claire knew better. Something was rotting down there. Something that never died clean. And it had teeth. And it remembered. Claire had never believed in ghosts. Not really. As a child, she had laughed at the stories others whispered during sleepovers, had rolled her eyes at horror movies and paranormal documentaries. But now, sitting at her kitchen table with damp clothes folded in the sink and dirt still trapped, under her fingernails she felt haunted. Not by spirits in the traditional sense, but by something older, heavier. The past had followed her home from the lake and was now settling in the corners of her apartment like mold. Everything looked the same, but the silence was different. It was no longer peaceful. It was a pause between warnings. She laid the photos out on the table, the ones she'd recovered from Julian's folder. At first glance, they were ordinary, smiling women in sunlit places, taken in soft focus. But the longer she stared, the more wrongness bled through the gloss. Their expressions didn't reach their eyes. Their shoulders were always slightly turned as if caught mid-flinch. Each photo had the same backdrop, the cabin, the lake, the trees. Always the same 3 locations, always summer, always isolation. She flipped one over. A name, Julia. Another, Natalie. Another had no name, just a date, 2009. Claire's breath hitched. That was the year he told her he'd been on a sabbatical to write. She traced her finger along the edge of the photograph. What was he doing? Why keep these? Why hide them in a sealed folder under a floorboard? And then it hit her. Not just that these women were gone, but that they had been part of something bigger, something intentional. Like chapters in a book. Each one closed before the next began. He hadn't just moved on. He had erased them. Later that evening, she stood in the hallway of her sister's home, now Julian's home, with her palms pressed against the wall, listening. Every creak, every breath of the house felt too deliberate. She wandered into the guest room, the one no one ever used. It was empty, clean to the point of sterility. but it smelled wrong. Not bad, just too new. Like something had been replaced. She opened the closet. Nothing but a folded quilt. Still, the feeling remained. She was about to leave when she noticed a frame on the dresser. It was turned toward the wall. Slowly, she picked it up and flipped it around. Her throat tightened. It was a family photo. Julian, a woman, and 2 children. The woman looked vaguely familiar. The kids were smiling. Everyone looked happy. But she'd never seen this family, never heard him mention them. And there was something too perfect about the composition, too curated. Like it had been, arranged for an audience. On the back, in elegant handwriting, was a single line. Autumn 2015, before everything changed. She didn't sleep. Her dreams were jagged, fragmented images of children standing at the foot of her bed, their faces half obscured by shadow. Mouths open as if screaming, but no sound coming out. When she awoke, the light in the hallway was on, even though she remembered turning it off. The air in the room was cold. She sat up slowly and listened. Nothing. Just the buzz of silence. The next morning, she went to the town records office. She didn't know what she was searching for, only that the woman in the photo had to be real, or had been. She provided the names she remembered from the photo and waited as the clerk typed, the keys clacking like distant footsteps. Then he paused, looked closer at the screen. His eyes narrowed. Claire leaned forward. The names matched a missing persons report. Filed. In 2016, a woman and 2 children. Last seen leaving a private cabin with a man named Julian Bishop. That wasn't his name now. But it had been. Claire left the office with her stomach turning to ice. The report had never been followed up. No one had seen them since. It was labeled as presumed runaway and quietly closed the following year. No media, no family to push for answers. Just a short summary and a few outdated photos. Back at her apartment, Claire stared at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back. Her eyes were bloodshot, her hair unkempt, her hands trembling at her sides. She couldn't shake the feeling that those children in her dream had been trying to tell her something, that maybe they weren't just fragments of guilt, but echoes, and that Julian's past wasn't buried. It was leaking through the cracks. That night, she returned to the lake again. The wind had picked up, the trees whispering warnings through the branches. She brought a flashlight this time, and something else, a shovel. The water lapped at the shore as she walked the perimeter, searching for the small wooden post she remembered from before. It marked something. She didn't know what, but she knew she needed to dig. The ground was soft, soaked, from days of rain. It gave way easily under the shovel's edge. She dug until her muscles burned, until her fingernails split, and then she hit something. Wood, thin, splintered. She pulled away the dirt and exposed the edge of a box. Not large, child-sized. Her vision blurred. Her throat seized. She knew before she opened it. Inside was a pair of shoes, small, mud-caked. Beneath them, a doll, water-damaged, its face split open, revealing stuffing, and beneath that, a necklace. The same necklace she'd seen in the family photo. Her hands slipped as she closed the lid and fell back, the earth swallowing her scream. The woods around her remained silent, watching. Claire sat in the dirt until sunrise, hollowed out and shaking. The truth was clear now. Julian hadn't just left a trail of broken hearts. He had left graves, families, futures, and he had buried them all with the same smile he used to tell her he loved her. And now, he was sleeping next to her sister, calling her family, starting again. Claire wiped the dirt from her palms and stood. The air was colder now, sharper. She no longer felt haunted, she felt called. Because ghosts don't whisper for sympathy, they scream for justice. And she was finally listening. The question had been gnawing at her for days, but now it roared in her head like a siren she couldn't shut off. Had her sister known? It wasn't just about jealousy or betrayal anymore. It was about the unbearable possibility that someone she loved might have willingly stepped into the same darkness, might have looked at the same cracks in Julian's surface and chosen to pretend they weren't there. Claire couldn't stop replaying every moment of their recent conversations, every smile that had seemed too forced, every time her sister had changed the subject when Julian came up. She remembered the last dinner they'd had together, how her sister had said Julian was complicated, but that she liked that about him, how she had laughed when Claire asked if she really knew him. It didn't sound like love. It sounded like fear. The more Claire thought about it, the more she realized that her sister had begun to change the moment Julian entered their lives. At first it was subtle. She became quieter, more defensive, more private. But then it escalated. She stopped coming over, stopped answering calls. When Claire visited unannounced, she was met with strained smiles and eyes that never quite met hers. It was as if someone else had moved into her sister's skin. Claire sat at her laptop late that night scrolling through old photos. Birthdays, holidays, beach trips. Her sister had always been open, expressive, alive. But in every photo taken after Julian appeared, something was different. The light behind her eyes was dimmer, her posture more guarded. Claire noticed bruises in one photo, barely visible under a sleeve. In another, her smile was twisted at the edges just slightly. She hadn't seen it before. She hadn't wanted to. She remembered the letter she had found in Julian's study drawer, the one she hadn't told anyone about. It had been addressed to her. No name, just one page, folded neatly, with 2 lines scrawled in red ink. "You're just like the others, and I know how to make you stay." Claire hadn't known what it meant at the time, but now she was beginning to understand. Her sister hadn't fallen in love. She had been caught, entangled, like a fly in a web too elegant to see until it was too late. She returned to the cabin the next morning, alone, ignoring the pounding in her chest. The key Julian once gave her still worked. The house was quiet, too quiet. She walked through the rooms with slow, deliberate steps, listening for any sign that someone might be home. But there was only stillness and the weight of memories hiding behind the walls. In the living room, a cabinet stood slightly ajar. Inside, Claire found journals, not hers, not Julian's, her sister's, page after page of tense, scrawled handwriting. At first they were normal. Grocery lists, thoughts on work. Then came entries about feeling watched, about strange dreams, about waking up in rooms she didn't remember falling asleep in, about voices. And then, "He says I'm not like them, but sometimes I think he wants me to be." Claire's throat tightened as she read on. The entries grew more erratic. There were drawings, faces half erased, marked out violently in ink. One page was torn and retaped with only the words "he buried them" left legible in the corner. Claire slammed the book shut and stumbled back. She knew. Her sister had known. And she had stayed. It didn't make sense. Unless Julian had made her stay. Claire couldn't bear the thought, but it lodged deep inside her, impossible to ignore. She checked the rest of the house. There was a lock on the outside of the basement door. Heavy, industrial. The kind of lock meant to keep something in, not out. She opened it. The basement was cold and unfinished. A single light bulb swung from the ceiling. The walls were lined with shelves, but only one corner was disturbed. Furniture moved aside. A mattress dragged into the open, stained with something dark and old. And on the wall above it, more photos. This time, not just of past lovers. Claire's sister was there, her face barely visible in the corner of one frame, half in shadow. Pinned beside it was a list of names. Most were crossed out. Hers wasn't. Claire turned and ran. She didn't know how she made it back to her car. Her hands were shaking too badly to put the key in the ignition. Her heart pounded against her ribs like it wanted out. She stared at the house through the windshield and whispered to herself that it wasn't too late, that maybe she could save her sister, that maybe this wasn't the end. But deep down, Something inside her had already broken, because love doesn't come with locks and warnings written in blood, and family doesn't stay silent when monsters live under the same roof. Now, Claire understood the truth she had been too afraid to face. Her sister hadn't just been manipulated, she had been part of it. Whether by fear, by force, or by choice, she had known, and knowing made everything worse. The lake was silent that morning, the kind of silence that comes after a storm but before the wreckage is discovered. The sky was a heavy slate of gray, unmoving, reflecting off the water like dull steel. Claire stood at the edge of the old dock, her boots sinking slightly into the damp wood, her hands clenched around the oars she hadn't touched in years. Behind her, the shoreline was empty, except for her car parked awkwardly by the trees and the faint rustling of leaves that sounded more like whispers than wind. The boat, an old rowboat left behind by a previous owner, rocked gently in the shallows. It had no motor, no name, just splintered edges and worn paint like it had witnessed more than one secret disappear into the lake. Claire pushed it out with the heel of her boot and climbed in, each movement sharp with purpose. She didn't look back. There was nothing to go back to. She rowed without rhythm, without grace, the oars slicing into the still surface, leaving long, trembling ripples in her wake. The cold air bit at her skin, and the mist that clung to the lake's center grew thicker with every foot she crossed. This was the place, the one she had seen in the photos, the one mentioned in the journal entries. The deep part, where the water turned black and sound seemed to die before reaching the surface. Her hands were blistered by the time she stopped. The oars floated beside the boat, tied loosely with twine, swaying like pendulums. Claire reached into her coat and pulled out the bundle, the journal, the photograph, the necklace her sister used to wear. Her fingers trembled as she tied them together, not ceremoniously but methodically like preparing evidence. She stared at them for a long time before placing them at her feet. Then she reached down into the bottom of the boat and uncovered what she hadn't told anyone she brought, the weighted chain, the grappling hook. It had taken her hours to find it in the old barn. She didn't know what she was expecting to retrieve. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. She dropped the hook into the water. The chain followed with a cold, metallic clatter that disappeared into a wet splash. The ripples spread out and faded. She began to pull. Slowly, carefully. The hook caught nothing at first. Then something gave. A shift in pressure, a drag. Her muscles strained. The rope grew taut. She pulled harder. Something broke the surface. It wasn't a body, not fully. It was the remains of something wrapped in fabric, waterlogged and stiff. A bone, a piece of clothing, hair still clinging to the folds of a tattered jacket. Claire felt her stomach turn, bile rising in her throat, but she didn't let go. She stared down at the thing below her, this fragment of someone who had once lived, once breathed, once trusted. There was no mistaking the necklace looped around the exposed vertebrae. It matched the one her sister wore, the same one from the photo. Only this one was cracked, stained, fused with algae and time. Claire dropped the rope. The bundle slipped silently back beneath the surface. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. Her body was past those responses. Instead, she sat perfectly still as the lake swallowed its secret again. She didn't know if it was her sister or one of the others. Maybe it didn't matter anymore. Maybe they were all pieces of the same story, a story written in bruises and lies and the quiet obedience of women who had smiled for the camera before vanishing forever. She looked back toward the shore. From this distance, the cabin was only a silhouette, dark and unfeeling. It didn't look like a place of horror. It looked like a memory, a storybook house on the edge of a perfect postcard, but inside it was rot. Inside it were walls that had heard screams, floors that had soaked in blood, and a man who had lived there, charming and unreadable, who had turned love into a weapon and secrets into monuments. Claire knew she couldn't go back. Not to that house, not to that life. Not even to the version of herself who had believed that heartbreak was the worst thing a man could do. That version was gone, replaced by someone else. Someone who had seen the bottom of the lake and knew what floated just beneath the surface of affection. She didn't row back for a long time. She let the boat drift, her eyes fixed on the water, waiting for a sign, a ripple, a bubble, a voice. But there was nothing, only the weight of what had been pulled up. Only the truth, dark and shapeless, wrapped around her like the mist. And when she finally did return to shore, she left the boat where it was. She didn't tell anyone what she had found. She didn't file a report. She didn't go to the police. Because some things can't be fixed. Some stories don't end with justice. They end with silence. With the sound of water closing over something that was never meant to be discovered. Claire walked into the trees and disappeared. And the lake, patient and vast, swallowed the morning whole.